Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Mindful Constitution podcast. I am here with my friend, colleague, peer, Ellen Davenport. Hello, Ellen.
Hello. Hi. So nice to be here. Excited.
I'm excited too. I can't wait to dive in. So I'll introduce you a little bit and then let you do the real introducing, but it's really cool because Ellen and I actually did our master's program at the same school. So we both went to University of Western States and got our master's in human nutrition and functional medicine. And Ellen is now a practicing certified nutrition specialist and board certified health coach. And she works as an anti-diet nutritionist. Did I get all that right?
That sounds right. That sounds good. You're making me sound smart.
I know. Hey, we are smart. We are smart. So I wanted to definitely just start things off by kind of giving you the floor to just explain a little bit about how you describe anti-diet nutrition.
Sure. So at a very base level, or kind of a broad level, anti-diet nutrition to me means that we are learning about how food works and how food affects the body in a way that has nothing to do with weight or diet culture. So I practice a very weight neutral approach, meaning that I don't bring someone's body size into the conversation when we're talking about nutrition. I would consider myself to be a health at every size practitioner. And when we talk about nutrition, we're, of course, doing more therapeutic approaches to nutrition for my clients who have painful periods or digestive issues or, bad anxiety or depression or migraines, etc. We can use therapeutic approaches with nutrition and supplements, etc., to help them. But we also want to focus on how can I help this person improve their relationship with food, because a lot of my clients are coming in from a background of having dieted a lot in the past, or being pretty stuck in diet culture, feeling like they need to eat and be living in a way that is constantly targeted towards making them smaller or making them look a certain way that their community will approve of. And then lastly, I do work with folks who are maybe further along on the disordered eating spectrum. So someone who, for example, I work with folks who feel kind of stuck in like the binge restrict cycle, or maybe someone who went through eating disorder treatment years ago, but still feel that there's a lot of disordered kind of thoughts that are still present. So we work through that as well. I hope that was a pretty long-winded explanation, but it's a fairly nuanced concept, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And it always feels like whenever you have to explain what you do, I always feel like I just took an hour doing it.
Yeah, I missed the elevator pitch part of business. I should have gone to business school and learned how to do an elevator pitch.
No, totally. I would say that you did a really good job of explaining, for starters, your demographic kind of leans more towards like disordered eating and healing from some of the more toxic elements of diet culture and restriction and rules around eating. So it sounds like really moving away from following rules or specific set rigid plans and stuff like that is more fitting for that demographic.
Yeah, absolutely. So moving away from food rules and moving towards autonomy with food in your body, I teach a lot about intuitive eating and, how that can really free up space in someone's mind. And it's a really powerful thing to move towards food freedom and away from feeling really restricted in terms of how you think about food.
Right. Yeah. Food freedom was kind of what was coming to mind for me. And the idea of not basing everything off on a scale, that there's many ways in which we can measure our health outside of just weight. And in fact, just doing it based on weight can obviously not be the most productive measurement of success as well. So the one thing I wanted to do before we really dive into more about your work with clients and thoughts on more technical aspects of nutrition is hear about your own story. Because I know a lot of times, especially in health and wellness and coaching and the helping professions, often we have our own story that led us to want to help other people. And I know you have one of your own as well. So I would love to hear about yours and what brought you to this space of really working in disordered eating, anti-diet nutrition, also really helping people find balance in holistic health and hormonal health and all of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So starting in college, in undergrad for me, developed some really uncomfortable digestive issues that I think I had always had IBS-like symptoms. Like in high school, I would get stomach aches on the way to school. That was definitely surrounding anxiety, but I didn't really have the words for that yet. If I recall, anxiety wasn't really talked about that much when I was in high school. So at least not nearly as much as it is in pop culture now. And then in college, it kind of moved away from like, oh, sometimes I have diarrhea and that's like whatever, especially if I eat ice cream. But in college, it became more of a constant, like really uncomfortable bloating situation where it felt like my stomach was very distended. My bowel movements changed in terms of how everything just felt really uncomfortable. And I now have the terminology for probably what I was feeling, which was perhaps like this hypersensitivity in my gut, or they call it like visceral hypersensitivity, where folks with IBS actually have more nerve sensitivity to what's going on in the gut than someone who doesn't. And that can be, that means that I could be experiencing the same amount of gas or bloating as someone else, but to me, it feels so much more intense.
Magnified.
And as already a anxious person and what I would call a pretty sensitive person, I was very aware of my body, and I became very obsessed and fixated on how I felt physically. I began to do like a lot of body checking, not from a sense of like concerns about my body image, but fear around what was going on inside my body because I felt like I had no idea what was going on. I started going to a lot of doctors, and I felt very dismissed by what they had to say about what was going on for me. In retrospect, I do think that it was linked to stress and anxiety for me. It was a very pivotal time for me in college, and I was studying to become a teacher, and I realized that that's not what I wanted to do. So I was also in a few different relationships that were a little messy. So there was a lot going on at the time. Yeah. And my mom was going through cancer treatment as well. And, in retrospect, I'm like, oh my gosh, you poor little baby Ellen, you were
like, I had a couple things happening.
Yeah. You were like so clearly anxious, but I didn't know about the strong connection between the brain and the gut at the time. So when my doctors told me like, it's just anxiety or you're having these like psychosymptomatic symptoms, like it felt very dismissive. I mean, still, I would say that it was just not handled properly. I did start going to therapy, which was helpful. My gut issues actually didn't really get better until I moved away from college. But while I was in school, I was put on a low FODMAP diet by a gastroenterologist. I didn't work with this person long term. So when I do work with clients now, and if I am putting on anyone on an elimination diet, which I wouldn't do for someone who has disordered eating, but when I work with,
I thought that was like an important point just to interject that I didn't touch upon is like using therapeutic diets like in a targeted way where so
Mm-hmm.
many people use them to like lose
Mm-hmm.
weight when in reality they were
Yeah.
created for therapeutic reasons, not just
Right. It
like
was it was kind of just given to me, and now I'm like, oh my goodness, if I was to go back in time, I should have been working with someone who I was checking in with weekly to see how things were going, because I was just I was 20, 19, and I was just given this like list of eat this, don't eat this. And I became very obsessed with what I was allowed to eat and what I wasn't allowed to eat. Um, it felt really restrictive. That is a really restrictive diet. So
Mhm.
anyone who is trying the low FODMAP diet for digestive issues, please work with a practitioner. And it should be short term, as in like 6 weeks or so, not 6 months like I did it. So I did it, didn't feel any better, but was still very obsessed with doing that. I was also drinking a lot at the time as well. So that's clearly not helping the issues,
Yes.
not sleeping, etc. But
Anxiety.
anxiety. So I kind of just gave up at one point about the food, and I was like, well, I guess this is my stomach. I'm at least going to enjoy what I'm eating. So I remember very specifically like going to Bojangles. I was in North Carolina at the time, and just being like, I'm going to have a fried chicken sandwich because I'm going to feel sick regardless. So that was like a turning point for me to just kind of be like, F it. I don't know what's going on.
Yeah.
Moved away. Stomach actually started feeling better. It did resurge at one point, but that really helped me realize like, wow, this is very connected to my environment, my stress levels,
My mental state.
my mental state. So second time around, I was like, I'm figuring this out. And that's when I became very interested in like holistic health. And that's when I entered like, it was like inter wellness culture on Instagram. Started following a lot of people that I don't follow anymore, but I can like,
Gwyneth Paltrow. No.
you know, their handles pop right into my brain. I don't need to shout
Name.
them out or anything, but I started really becoming obsessed with food in a different way, which felt at the time, I was like, wow, I'm becoming the healthiest person alive in terms of how I approach food. But when I look back on it now, I'm like, that was still restriction. Like there
And
were
like
still food rules.
hyperfixation.
Yes. I started an Instagram account that was kind of centered around like healing my body with food. But like I was trying to take like aesthetic pictures of my food, and I was like eating superfoods, quote unquote, and, you know, telling everybody how it all made me feel. And it was just it was the result of me having a really hard time.
Yeah.
So I ended up going back to school. That's
Yeah.
what kind of like pushed me to enroll at UWS. I loved it. I learned a lot, and started kind of deconditioning some of the stuff that is just online. They're just fads. Deconditioning some of that. But also still very much on we need to be eating healthy, quote unquote, all the time. And I definitely think I had a lot of morality placed on eating well. That if you're eating healthy, you're a better person. And if you're not, then you got some work to do. And that has been what I've been trying to, that's me putting my own, that's me projecting. Right. And so I've been trying to uncondition myself from that, as well as I've exited school and have been on my journey of building out my own practice. I originally started seeing people purely to focus on hormonal, mental, and gut health, the three things that I had issues with, because I had a lot of empathy for people who were struggling with IBS symptoms, were struggling with painful periods, which was my journey as well as anxiety and depression. But what helped me pivot to more the disordered eating land was that I noticed that a lot of my clients had issues with their relationship with food that needed to be taken care of before we could move on to the therapeutic side of things. So you can take as many supplements as you want, but if you're not feeding yourself properly, and if you have a lot of guilt around the type of foods that you're eating, or you're constantly trying to make your body smaller, etc., then those supplements aren't going to do shit for your period or your IBS or your anxiety. Like we need to figure out the foundations before we can build upon that. So, and then it also, you know, throughout that, I came to terms with a lot of like my history of, I would say disordered eating patterns, and realizing, oh, wow, I actually feel healthier than I ever have, having a much more balanced relationship with food, allowing myself to eat the foods that at one point I labeled as bad and unhealthy, in combination with, you know, intuitive eating is eating in a way that makes you feel good, you know? So that's bringing in the foods that make you feel good emotionally, bringing in the foods that make you feel good physically, and it all fits together ideally in this seamless way eventually.
Yeah. Yeah. So many interesting themes in what you are saying. And it's one thing that really stood out to me was the like medical gaslighting, and then looking back in hindsight and realizing, oh, if I had just known the right questions to ask. And this is something I have even just been experiencing a lot with pregnancy, where it's just, there's just approach things in a very streamlined, standardized way. And if you don't know the questions to ask and you don't know what your options are, then you don't know how to advocate for yourself, and you do just get funneled through a system that has one way of dealing with things. So that really stood out to me. And then it's so interesting how a lot of your physical symptoms were psychological, impacted by your psychological state. And so it's almost like full circle in your career trajectory, because you're like, okay, let me like deal with all these physical imbalances, when in reality, what you needed to do for yourself and what you're realizing a lot of people need to do, and what I also see a lot of people need to do in their relationship with alcohol, is like look at the root cause of dysfunction, which is generally some type of trauma or anxiety or lack of emotional regulation, that they're just like, it's exerting itself and expressing itself in this search for like a quick fix or like an answer. I want an answer, when what really needs healing is just that relationship to self. And it's like nothing else is going to be helpful until you're able to like heal the relationship to yourself. And then you're not going to feel the need to be like hyper fixated on everything you're eating and controlling everything you're eating and being perfect there, or self-medicating, right? So it all comes back a lot in so many cases to just self-love, self-compassion, really getting to the root cause of like your traumas, whatever they are, your anxieties.
And unfortunately, that is a lot harder than signing up for a diet. Right. So I have most of my clients have a long history of dieting.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of my clients were put on diets by their parents. So I say, like, it is not your fault that this is how you think about food, or this is how because this is how you've been brought up to think about it. You've literally been conditioned to think about your body and food in this way. But it is now your responsibility to yourself to heal this, right?
Right.
And that is a lot harder to confront and to put the work in,
Mm-hmm.
because it gets messy and yucky, and but it's also extremely rewarding. Unlike diets, you know, the diets that they've been doing for their entire lives, those are that you get that like instant gratification when you lose like a few pounds at first. And then you're like, wow, it's really working. It's really working. And sometimes it feels good to have rules, especially anxious people. We thrive on being told exactly what to do, kind of.
Structure.
Yeah, structure.
Control.
So when they're put into that environment, it feels really good at first until they realize
that they have
starting
no tools to
that they're starting
forward.
to feel uncomfortable, and they're starting to really crave foods, and they're starting to really feel like, oh my gosh, my body is just out of control. And that's how the diet cycle kind of ends up happening, is because they like, wow, I failed. I'm such a failure. It's just compounding this, like, I need more structure. So then they'll start over the diet, or start a new diet, versus, wow, I need to let's tear down the house and work on the foundation and then build a better house.
I mean, to be fair, like you said, that's really hard. And I see so many parallels between, and we did a live about this too, between drinking culture and diet culture. And it really plays on humans' tendency to outsource our power or to look for quick fixes or band-aid solutions. And they're so normalized. It's so normalized to drink for stress. It's so normalized to just go on another diet at the beginning of the new year rather than like get to the root cause of the issues around your relationship with food, or get to the root cause around why you feel the need to self-medicate with alcohol, and everyone else is doing it. So when you're confronted with this like very normalized quick fix versus, or you can sit uncomfortably with yourself and do this really hard inner work that a lot of people aren't doing, and it's going to suck really bad before it gets a lot better, but you can do it.
Absolutely.
They really have to be in the space to like look in the mirror, sit with themselves.
And it's not just them. It ends up being like, I actually had 2 conversations with clients this morning about the fact that they're talking to their families now about it. Like, it's not, and I'm sure it's the same with alcohol. It's not just you in this situation. It's, it's do you have to set boundaries with your family? Do you have to tell your mom to stop commenting on your body every time that you see her?
Which is why it's like the cycle breakers can be very healing for people around them, but it's very challenging to be that person that's the first one to kind of like step outside of family cycles, societal cycles, because
it doesn't seem fair.
Yeah. And then if other people aren't really excited to look in that mirror, they're like, yeah, can you shut the fuck up, please?
I think often we expect other people to like get right on board, and that is not always going to be the case. And it may be at some point, but probably not right now. And like to build in systems, and I have a program that I do with clients, and part of the ending part is talking about your environment and your community. And that's messy too, because it's like, do some of your relationships currently not serve the work that you're trying to do? Like, let's take a deeper look at what's going on around you, and how can we create an environment that's really going to be fulfilling for you, and what do we need to tweak? What do we need to add on? Is there room for you to maybe meet more people who are more like-minded to what you're doing currently?
Yeah, crowding out a little
and that's
bit.
hard.
It's so hard. And it's a very similar thing with drinking, as you
of course,
imagine.
yeah.
It's just the idea that so many people feel afraid that when they choose themselves and they put themselves first, what impact is that going to have on the relationships in their lives? And ultimately, like you said, and I'm sure with health coaching and motivational interviewing and all of these things, where you're never going to be able to just confront someone with changes you've made and expect them to just be told that they should make the same changes or do what you're doing or get right on board. Like you said, it has to really come, just as we said, that desire to heal and really do the inner work has to come from you, because it can't be forced upon you. And the more like it even is the more that we try to impose that on other people, the more they innately resist, is just human nature. But yeah, so interesting. All right, I have like a million more questions for you. I feel like
it's a 3-hour episode.
Yeah. Buckle in, people.
This was the introduction.
Yeah, like that was my first question of 7. So I know, and I try to like weave in these parallels with alcohol and food, because I think it's just so interesting for both of our listeners. But there's a lot of subconscious programming around diet culture, obviously. And so if you were to say kind of the main patterns of programming that we're inundated with diet culture that really shape our relationship to ourselves and our health, like what are some of the main ones that come to mind? And I think this is so important, because even you said like this deconditioning process and this almost like awakening to the belief systems that we're saturated with. It's like you kind of have to uncover those before you can pursue change on any level.
Yeah.
And so I think it's just a helpful tool to pass along, especially coming from you. What do you see as some of the more toxic programming
Yeah.
within diet culture?
I would say that a lot of my clients are coming in with this belief that their body is out to get them or is constantly kind of working against them if they're not monitoring it. So, for example, I think it's very normalized in diet culture and wellness culture potentially for people to be weighing themselves very frequently. I, part of my work with clients is increasing respect with their bodies and showing respect to their bodies. And part of that is, okay, what is the situation that you're putting yourself in every morning? Let's say if someone weighs themselves every morning, they step on the scale. What do you expect to see? And what information are you then giving back to yourself after you see that number, right? Or how does that number then impact how you're going to eat that day, how you're going to treat yourself that day?
Talk to yourself.
How you're going to talk to yourself that day. So I gently recommend that my clients don't use their scales. I had someone last week tell me that she put her scale away. This is like the first week that we're working together. She put her scale away for the first time in years. And a lot of anxiety comes up with that naturally because the programming that we're given is if I'm not watching out and I'm, we're working on introducing or reintroducing quote unquote fear foods, meaning that, foods that maybe you haven't allowed yourself to eat in the past, this increase in anxiety and fear over, oh my gosh, my body I'm not watching, like it's just going to keep getting bigger and bigger. So starting this process of learning how to respect your body enough to know that it knows what it's doing. It knows how to digest these foods. Your metabolism knows what to do. We don't need to be monitoring it. We can kind of trust the process a little bit more. So that I think is one that we think that our bodies, if not on a diet and not following strict rules, things are just going to go wild and get out of control. Where that's really not the case. In intuitive eating, in regards to weight, I don't focus on weight loss with clients, but in regards to weight with intuitive eating, the expectation is that your body will find a homeostasis. If we are eating in a balanced way, your body will land somewhere in a homeostatic position, meaning that we're not going to be weight cycling anymore. You're not going to go through these phases of, oh, I lost 20 pounds, but then I gained 30, but then I lost 15, and then I gained 20. Like weight cycling, it has been shown to be much more unhealthy and actually more predictive of getting metabolic issues like diabetes than staying at a consistent weight, even if that weight is maybe heavier than what you were hoping for.
Right. Yeah. So that's a big one. And it actually really leads me into my next question, because I think what you're saying is that diet culture has definitely perpetuated a sense of distrust in ourselves, right? And our ability to make choices without constantly monitoring ourselves. So my next question is kind of, how do we help people? So I know we have a lot of people coming with disordered eating, for you specifically, but in general, when people have been inundated with diet culture and they're on this like restrictive cycle, or maybe they don't even have a ton of nutritional knowledge, or if they do, it's very like diet culture specific, like these rules from Weight Watchers or point system or this or that. How do we get someone from that space to intuitive eating without structure in between? And also, how do we, and not that I'm saying there is no structure, but what is like the staircase from fully not trusting yourself from diet culture to trusting yourself? And also, I guess I'll start there because I have a second part to that question.
So I'm going to say something probably unpopular as a clarification, but I would consider following a diet a form of disordered eating, not an eating disorder. Like those are very different things that like I was saying with my own history, I definitely had patterns of disordered eating.
Mm-hmm.
But in my opinion, and in the opinion of kind of the intuitive eating world, following a diet plan is a form of disordered eating. So that being said, moving someone from that to the intuitive eating world is first we need to become aware of the patterns that you do have. I work first. I'd like to do a history of dieting history dieting history in the United States, because it really helps people understand, like, whoa, it is just a pile of, a timeline of fad diets one after another that completely contradict themselves. That is very helpful for people learning
to disregard a lot of their
Yes.
prior knowledge.
that at one point you weren't allowed to eat fat, and another point we're only eating fat, and at one point we're not allowed to eat. Yeah, exactly. Keto, etc. And so that is really helpful. And then we start moving into, I want to know how you currently label foods. A lot of us, even farther along in our journey, are still doing this like subconscious labeling of foods as good or bad. And in intuitive eating, we have a very neutral view of foods, meaning that a food, whether it is a cupcake or a salad, is neither good nor bad. It's just a food. It's going to, because of how it's made up, it's going to impact you a little bit differently. You're going to get a different amount of energy from it. You might feel differently physically, but that's all just data, right? So you choose to eat a salad with a piece of toast on the side as your lunch, and then you're going to eat that mindfully, and then you're going to kind of tune in afterwards and say, okay, how do I feel? Do I feel satisfied emotionally? Because that's a really big piece of the work that I do with clients. Do I feel satisfied physically? Am I full? Do I even know what full feels like? A lot of my clients have been on restrictive diets, or like listening to when I'm allowed to eat based on the diet for so long that they're not even aware of their hunger and fullness cues anymore, or they're only aware of them when they're extremely strong and unpleasant. Or overly full. So we work on the hunger and fullness scale and start tuning into these like more gentle cues and learning how to respond to those appropriately. And then there's a lot of, it's all just mindfulness. It's tuning into like, how did that cupcake make me feel? It made me
when you're eating.
Yeah, it made me happy because I love chocolate. But I also got a stomach ache later. So maybe next time I will try to eat it slower, or maybe next time I realize that gluten makes my stomach hurt. Maybe I won't have that next time and I'll eat a gluten-free cupcake, but that would make me just as happy. So it's not, intuitive eating isn't like, oh, I'm just going to eat donuts all the time because I have no rules anymore. Not at all. I work with people who have digestive issues and more like autoimmune conditions that can't eat certain foods. Intuitive eating can still be brought into that, because intuitively you might say, I'm not going to eat fast food all the time because that won't make me physically feel well afterwards, because I learned that. But morally, there's nothing wrong with it if you still choose to do that. If you were like, I'm eating fast food every day, cool, you're still a great person. I think that our diet culture is very like, if you're not eating the way that we're telling you to eat, then that makes you a less worthy person. But you don't owe anybody your health.
I think that clarification of explaining the nuance with intuitive eating is so important, especially when you're holding it up against diet culture, because I hear people all the time when I talk to them about like no good or bad foods, and they're like, woohoo, coming from diet culture, they're like, no bad foods, because they're saturated with rules. And so it's almost like this converse system of rules that people think, and then when you really dive into it, and this was part of my next question, was where do we find that balance between bringing people away from diet culture, not labeling food as good or bad, but also, we have the standard American diet and we have chronic disease on the rise and all of these issues that are nutritionally related. But like what you're saying, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but this is my understanding of intuitive and mindful eating, is that not labeling food as good or bad isn't a free for all to just eat shit food all the time and expect to be healthy. It's more of like an empowering system of guidelines around mindful eating and tuning into your body and your hunger cues and things you may be ignoring and looking at the feedback food is giving you. And often, if you're honest with yourself, if you were to eat the standard American diet 24/7 mindfully, you probably wouldn't be feeling wonderful most of the time.
Yeah. And I want to call it, and I think this was a slip on your part, but you said shit food. So I do think that we have we just think of food as like, well, that's junk food and that's healthy food. But like I was saying earlier, like I have never probably since high school had more flexibility in my diet. Like the fact that I can recall 2 times that I've had soda in the past couple of weeks is remarkable compared to how I thought about food and would limit myself 5 years ago. But I also have never felt healthier, and I've never felt mentally healthier. I've never felt more satisfied by food. So there is some, and that's going to look different for every single person. One thing I find with folks as we're taking away food rules and as we're helping them embrace more intuitive eating, they may find an increase in eating what would be considered junk food, right? Because they're like, oh my gosh, I'm allowed to eat this. And that's totally normal. I give the example of like, I have a few examples. So one in my own life, this is just super small. Over Christmas, I got these like candy cane kisses because I really like those. And typically I would not have, years ago, I wouldn't have allowed even candy in my house, but because there's that fear of like, oh, I'll just eat it all. But actually allowing yourself the permission to eat it, at first you may find that you're eating a lot of it because it's like, oh, it's there and it's exciting and new. So I was eating some with like each meal. It's like very exciting. But then because I had a lot of them, over the couple weeks, I started eating less and less. And actually at one point I realized like, oh yeah, I still have a full bowl, but I haven't touched it in a few days because it's no longer exciting. And I have this unconditional permission to eat, which is what we are trying to put across, is like, you are allowed to eat no matter what the circumstances are. I don't care what your body looks like. I don't care that you ate 30 minutes ago. If you're still hungry, you're allowed to eat.
Right.
Awesome. There's no rules there, but at a larger scale, not just the kisses, but like I have a client currently who, maybe she had been dieting for a long time and is experimenting with bringing in new foods that she wouldn't allow herself to eat. And she's probably eating more of them currently than she will in 2 months from now because it's exciting and it should be exciting. It's awesome that you're allowing yourself to eat that, but at some point it's not going to be as exciting, and that's cool too. So kind of allowing this like ebb and flow of foods into your life, because once your body realizes like, oh, we can count on having this again, then it's not going to be having those like obsessive thoughts about like, oh, I really want some chocolate, but I'm not allowed to have chocolate. But what if I just had like a bite of it? Oh, you're not allowed to.
Yeah. It's kind of just the classic, you want what you can't have, psychological pull and draw.
Absolutely.
And one other thing I think is important to highlight, especially when we talk about the connection between the gut and the brain and the psychology and physical health and, what we were talking about in the past, like anxiety's effect on health, is so important too, because there is that the tools around mindful eating where you can tune into, and if you do continue to binge on these, on the chocolate treats or whatever, because it's exciting, and then you're tuning into your body and being like, I actually don't feel the best now, and it kind of like loses its excitement. It is empowering us with that feedback information, but also having the psychological stress around our choices and how we're eating is so important too, regardless of what it is. And so, I mean, kind of touching on that, if somebody is very consumed orthorexia, consumed with what they're eating, and they're highly stressed about eating super healthy all the time, what effect is the psychological stress having? Versus if you allow yourself a little bit more food freedom, empower yourself with feedback tools about how you're feeling based on what you're eating and the choices you're making, then it's kind of finding this delicate balance between the relationship with how we're eating and what we're eating, because both are, important.
Absolutely. And my intuitive eating is going to look really different from somebody else's. And that's great. I think that's awesome. And you may find, as you're going through your journey, like, I'm still encouraging people to eat more fruits and vegetables. It's not like working in the disordered eating space or like doing intuitive eating means I'm not like using some of the more like classic nutritional tools. It's helping clients embrace. I talk a lot about like eating your colors rather than like this half of the plate needs to look like this and this needs to like, it's much more like, how can we together build a plate for you that is emotionally and physically satisfying? Maybe it means having half a plate of vegetables one day. Maybe the next day it's a quarter of a plate of vegetables, but we always try to get a carbohydrate, a protein, and a fat on there. And maybe it's bringing a freaking cookie on the side because that would make you happy. And that's great too. But like really trying to bring in foods that are going to physically make you feel good, because that will kind of improve this like
upward spiral
of just how you feel, but also making sure that like we're not forcing ourselves to eat anything. I have clients who have ARFID or have really strong textural issues or whatever avoidant issues with food. I'm not going to force them to eat a salad or spinach or something if they hate that. It's finding ways that work for them to make sure that they're still getting the nutrients that they need. But it's going to look different for everybody.
Yeah, I love it. Weaving in that feedback from our choices as a source of empowerment, putting in nutritional education. Like you said, it's not just like no good or bad food and it's do whatever. It's more of like, here's tools to know, like these are generally beneficial rules that almost anyone can follow when it comes to food. There's some nutritional rules, I guess, is not allowed.
Yeah, I would say more, it's like working on, so there's kind of a hierarchy of needs with someone in terms of disordered eating. So we're going to start with, are you eating enough to begin with? So that's the first thing I work on, is helping make sure that we're getting an adequate amount of food into you. Then we're going to look at, well, that adequacy along with consistency of eating. Regardless of what you're eating, let's just get you into the pattern of eating something on every 3 to 4 hours to help. That's going to make you feel so much better just in general. I don't care if you're eating like a waffle by itself with nothing else. If that makes you happy, cool. And then after we get that adequacy and consistency down, then we move on to, can we bump up things a little bit, because I can tell that you're not getting enough protein, or I can tell that you're not getting enough fat. So we need to increase nutrient density. Right. Is kind of how I refer to that, more so than like the healthiness of the food. So maybe you're still eating a waffle, but this time we're putting
strawberries on it.
Maybe there's 2 waffles. Maybe there's some peanut butter. Maybe there's, diversity. I like to start with people where they are. So building upon the foods that they already feel safe around and feel like we can kind of build up from there. And then as they're feeling more comfortable and confident, like, wow, cool, I can do this. Then we start working on bringing in foods that maybe they have some fears about. I was told by a client that she had ice cream for the first time in a long time. And it's like, awesome. How did you like it? Another client had an orange for the first time because she always was told that like fruits were too much sugar. And she's like, I actually didn't really like it that much. I'm like, that's cool. How about something else? So it's learning more opinions about what you actually think about the food and building out a life that works for you, rather than listening to like what diet culture or what some random person on Instagram is telling you what you should or should not be eating.
Yeah. Sourcing your power internally.
Yeah, sure. I like that.
And so, okay, let's see. I have a few more and then we'll wrap things up before it gets to an hour because I don't want people to lose their attention spans here. So I know you did a lot with hormonal health in the backs and kind of prior to moving into more disordered eating. And so can you speak a little bit to how disordered eating impacts hormones and women's health a little bit more?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I feel like the most commonly known information about eating disorders and hormones is that a lot of people with anorexia, specifically restrictive anorexia, are, we see amenorrhea a lot. So a lack of periods with folks with anorexia. We see a lot of cycle irregularities with folks who have maybe binge purge anorexia or binge eating disorder. PCOS, polycystic ovary syndrome, is very commonly found in binge eating disorder. So that can really contribute to the binging can really contribute to insulin sensitivity or insulin resistance. And that can, and testosterone can also impact impulse behavior with food. So it's kind of like this unfortunate cycle between PCOS and binging. So those are some common themes that we see in terms of how eating disorders impact hormones. But one thing that I recently did research on is how one's natural hormone shifts throughout their cycle impact their eating behavior, regardless of if someone has disordered eating or not. You'll notice that if you're aware of your cycle, that as you move through your cycle, in your follicular phase, when estrogen is higher, estrogen has a pretty modulating effect on eating behavior, or eating intake. So you may find that like you feel more easily satisfied by foods in your follicular phase or like the first half of your cycle up until ovulation. And then in the second half of your cycle, when progesterone rises up, the fact that it's there, estrogen also rises in the luteal phase, but progesterone has this impact of like antagonizing, it's an antagonist against estrogen's powers on eating behavior. So when progesterone is present, we may find that we are hungrier. We require more food intake or feel snackier during or have more cravings during our luteal phase. And to kind of go in that ebb and flow with your cycle can be extremely triggering with someone with disordered eating because they're thinking, why does my body need more right now? Why is it telling me that I need more? And that can be really scary and feel like your body's out of control. So you restrict more and more, wherein in reality, we are cyclical people. Menstruators are cyclical people, and we have changes and needs throughout our cycle. So I help people kind of embrace that as well, learning how to kind of read the data that your body's giving you each day, rather than thinking that things should be exactly the same every single day. That's why following a diet plan just doesn't work, in my opinion, because what you needed 2 weeks ago in terms of food is going to be is going to be different than it is today, because I'm about to start my period, and like I know that my body is going to want XYZ much more than it did a few weeks ago.
Yeah, right. And especially for women, like you're saying, with the fluctuations in cycle and hormones on a monthly basis. And that makes, especially when you think of diet culture being so much more focused and geared towards women and insecurities around body image. And so, yeah, just the lack of sustainability for that reason alone is important to point out. And so before I wrap things up and ask a couple more questions, I think one main thing that's important too, that is a big theme of what we've been talking about, and even what we were talking about before the podcast, is that it's really not one size fits all. And there's so much nuance to it as well. And that really being able to look at like your personal background is a big takeaway, right? And realize like, okay, if I have this history of disordered eating too, that's something to consider. That's going to make my approach to nutrition much different than someone without that, or even different ages, different sexes, different at exercise or energy expenditures, and so many factors that influence it, which I think is a big thing to point out too with diet culture, is just that prescribing a diet to everyone in a kind of widespread basis, when there's so many different variations amongst us all, different nutritional needs, different backgrounds, different traumas in our relationship with food. So really interesting stuff. And I wanted to kind of ask a couple questions before we wrap things up. And one is, I know you focus predominantly in disordered eating, but what would you say if you were to just say like your own personal nutrition philosophy for that could be widely applied? What would that be?
I would say no food rules.
Mm-hmm.
And well, I have a few things. Try to eat every 3 to 4 hours.
Yeah.
And as much as possible, we're trying to eat in our meals and in our snacks. You know, it's not always going to happen, but when we can, it's going to help make you feel a lot better. We're going to try to incorporate a carbohydrate, a protein, and a fat, and a pop of color in some way. Mm-hmm. That would be, it's absolutely not a rule. It's more a see how this makes you feel if you try it. And I think a lot of, it doesn't need to be more complicated than that. It can truly be like, how does it, the size of the carbs might differ, the size of the protein might differ, the size of the fat might differ depending on how you're feeling, but try to get in the different elements so that you can, you know, make all the neurotransmitters you need to be able to make in your brain, and make melatonin so you can sleep, all those things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's so simple. The ones that can really apply to more people's, like eat as many colors as you can. Mm-hmm. Remember to eat. It's not just what you're eating, it's the relationship you have to the meals. Mm-hmm. And that a big part of how our body digests things is the state that we're in when we're eating. Mm-hmm. So if we're on the go, or if we're sitting mindfully, all that stuff. And then lastly, share where people can find you.
Yeah, find me on Instagram. I am at your anti-diet BFF, spelled exactly how that sounds. You can also find me on my website, which is elevatedhealth.com, and that is spelled ELLEVATED health.com. It's a little play on my name, but it gets complicated because then people spell my website wrong. So
yeah.
That's it.
Yeah, I picked Mindful Constitution, so I'm just rolling with it now, but
maybe someday we'll both change our names. No, you got to just go with it.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for doing this. No more TikTok. Are you doing TikTok?
It's funny. I actually opened TikTok this morning and found that one of my friends had sent me 18 videos over the past several weeks. I just don't go on the app. For a while, I was posting on TikTok and then reposting on Instagram as a way to reach more people. But I've found that TikTok's just not my vibe. Yeah, I don't really get it. It's a little confusing to me, and Instagram.
They're working on banning it, so.
Oh, well, there you go.
Eliminated.
You can find me on TikTok too. It's the same username. I had one Instagram blow up that still is. One TikTok blow up that still gets attention. So that's
in that wave.
Yeah, still riding that wave a year later.
Oh my God, that's funny. Well, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.
I think it's so nice to kind of explore all sides of this, and looking to familiarize people with intuitive and mindful eating and how they can empower themselves. So if anyone's interested in learning more, reach out to Ellen.
Sweet.
Otherwise, we'll see you here next time on the Mindful Constitution podcast. Bye.